Who wants to be the next Italian wine ambassador? Join an exclusive network of 400 Italian wine ambassadors across 48 countries. Vinitaly International Academy is coming to Chicago on October 19th to 21st, and to Almaty, Kazakhstan from November 16th to 18th. Don't miss out. Register now at vinitaly.com.
Welcome to the Italian Grape Geek podcast. Join us as we explore personal stories of travel and tasting with Italy's must-know grape varietals. Chart your own course with My Italian Grape Geek Journal, your personal tasting companion to accompany the series. Available now on Amazon. With thanks to Colangelo and Partners for their generous support with this project.
Hi there, it's Andrea Eby back here with you to talk about Corvina, otherwise known as Corvina Veronese. Probably because it is the star of the Veneto, at least I think so. The name means, well, we think, little raven, and it actually is one of sort of a handful of Italian grape varieties that has a name that somehow relates to birds. We don't really know if the name is a reference perhaps to how the dark colored skins of the berries really resemble the dark feathers of a raven, or maybe simply the fact that the variety was and probably is a favorite snack of the raven bird. Other theories tie its name to words such as crova, which kind of translates to dark berries, or corba, which means a large basket, probably referencing, again, its kind of tendencies to have some higher yields, or cruina, which means unripe. That could kind of point to a name that is referencing its more sort of late ripening tendencies. So we don't know a lot about the history of Corvina, so we can't say for certain where the name comes from, but we do know that, considering how important it is in the wines of such areas as Valpolicella, the wines of Valpolicella, Amarone, Recioto, and of course Bardolino as well, it is really surprising that we don't know more about the history of the variety. There are, however, some perhaps more dubious references to what could have been Corvina, one by Alessandro Pacano, who in 1627 wrote of Vini Corvini in his self-help book of the day, which was called The Problem with Drinking Cold Beverages. And despite the title, which would suggest almost the opposite, he was actually quite a proponent of drinking cold beverages. He thought it really helped promote digestion. So he mentions this Vini Corvini in there, and we think, well, perhaps that could be a reference to our Corvina of today. Possible references pop up in 1755, 1810, but the first really reliable description isn't until 1824. Part of the difficulty tracing the vine's history seems to stem from the fact that many varieties and biotypes were kind of given this Corvina-like name. So you have varieties like Corvina comune, Corba, Corva, Corvinone, Corvinina, Corvina gentile, Corvina nera, Corvinone, Corvina rizzi, etc., etc., etc. Now we know through, genetic testing, etc., that many of these are in fact different varieties, while some are actually clones of Corvina. But all of this similar nomenclature has really complicated trying to untangle the past of Corvina. What we do know is that Corvina has a parent-offspring relationship with Refosco del Peduncolo, Rosso, and Rondinella. So connecting all of these kind of genetic dots leads us to an understanding that it therefore is probably likely a grandchild of Marzanino. Key features about Corvina in the vineyard, it has these sort of medium-sized bunches that are quite compact, and they tend to have this very long sort of wing bunch. And often it's so big, that kind of wing bunch, that it often almost looks like it's got two bunches. Hence, one of the colloquial names that we know for Corvina, which is Corvina doppia. The berries themselves have a kind of more olive kind of shape to them. So they almost resemble little black olives with that oval shape. And at harvest, they're often covered with this very generous bloom that gives them a kind of dusty appearance in the vineyard. Farmers, though, need to pay close attention to the variety because it does have, as I mentioned before, this propensity towards high yields. Botrytis, also with those tightly packed bunches, can be an issue. And so something that farmers need to watch for, because botrytis is not something that you want when you are choosing bunches, etc., especially for the appassamento process. The variety itself is also quite sun sensitive, and exposed bunches can quite easily become sunburned. And so I think this is one of the real reasons why it is really closely associated with the Pergola Veronese training system. That training system helps prevent disease pressure by keeping the bunches high above the kind of more humid ground, and exposes the canopy to more ventilation because you're allowing more wind to pass through the canopy. And then, of course, you have the berries hanging down underneath the canopy. So they're getting a lot of protection and really helping to mitigate the risk of sunburn. It does have quite thick skins, which make it an ideal candidate for the appassamento process, which also helps to concentrate the sometimes lacking sugars in the grape variety. And again, it's hard for us to really imagine in today's day and age that you would really be trying to do whatever you could to somehow concentrate and increase alcohol levels. Today, we hear more and more about farmers who are trying to decrease the natural alcohol levels in the grape bunches. There's just too much sugar accumulation. But Corvina does have this tendency to ripen fully, but without accumulating a lot or high levels of sugar. So when you do the appassamento process, you really help concentrate those sugars. In the glass, the wines, when you have them in Pirenza, so 100% Corvina, should never be opaque. So it is a wine that even top examples will have these kind of light ruby color, moderate tannins, nice refreshing acidity, aromas and flavors of violets, rosemary, balsam, cherry, blackberry, cinnamon. So just really like beautiful flavors, refreshing flavors. Corvina as a grape variety is most often blended. So it's rarer to find it as a 100% varietal example of Corvina. Most of it is blended into the wines of Valpolicella and Bardolino. When you're talking about Valpolicella DOC, Valpolicella Ripasso DOC, Amarone della Valpolicella DOCG, and Recioto della Valpolicella DOCG, you're looking at 45 to 95% of those blends being comprised of Corvina, or we'll learn a little bit more about in a minute, Corvinone. So it really does play a really starring role in a lot of those wines. When you move a little closer to Lake Garda, we're talking about Bardolino DOC, you're seeing it comprise 40 to 95% of those wines as well. As I mentioned, single varietal versions can be found. Probably the most famous is from Allegrini, La Poya. That one I do find quite a dark, kind of substantial example, probably because they're doing some very extended macerations in those examples. So you're looking at like almost close to a month of maceration with the skins, and then 20 months in French oak barrique. So it's quite a generous wine. Giovanni Tantini, Luigi Brunelli, Davide Sterza, they all make really delicious examples of 100% Corvino wines as well. My personal connection to Corvina probably came, I think maybe it was established in 2016 when, thanks to a friend, Serge Levesque of Longo since 1961, who's based in Verona, he set up some visits for me, including one to Quintorelli. And I can still remember to this day sitting in Beppe Quintorelli's historic tasting room, which is like nestled within the core of their brand new winery. And just, it was a magical experience. And I really kind of fell in love with the region at that moment. I've been lucky enough, I visited again in 2018 with a group of Wine Scholar Guild, Italian wine scholar educators, and we visited 5 or 6 different producers. And I really had the opportunity to start tasting examples of Valpolicella Superiore at that time, which was something I really hadn't had a lot of experience with until that point. Through Valpolicella Superiore, I really began to understand how Corvina was really capable of expressing the terroir where it was grown. In my market, the wines of Amarone and Ripasso are much more available. Although those are fantastic wines, they are wines more of process than of place, is what I would characterize them at. And so you learn to distinguish stylistic differences between vintages maybe, or between producers through those wines. But it's harder to really get a sense of the place from which the grapes came. But when you're there and you're tasting Valpolicella Superiore, you really start to be able to taste the difference between the wines grown in the Classica area versus the Orientale area. That's what interests me the most about Corvina, is just how much potential there is within Valpolicella to really develop the expressions of these various terroirs. As I mentioned before, there's only a couple examples of varietal Corvina available in my market, but there are quite a few examples of Ripasso and Amarone, and starting to be more examples of the basic Valpolicella and the Superiore wines. In terms of who would we talk about in terms of, producers, as I mentioned, there are only a few that are making these varietal expressions. If we branch out into, producers of Valpolicella, Amarone, that sort of thing, then we're talking a much bigger list. And I'm going to be talking in a few minutes with you about Corvinone. So I'll save some of those producer names and mention them then. Food pairing wise, Corvina can find itself being expressed in so many different ways depending on which style of wine it's being used to produce. We can probably talk about food pairings again when we talk about Corvinone, because they are going to often be blended together. A lot of the foods that goes with one will go with the other. So let's move on to talking about Corvinone. Despite the variety's name, which literally translates into the big Corvina, you think when it's called the big Corvina that it would just be, it looks like Corvina, but much bigger. But in fact, it's actually not really that easy to distinguish between Corvinone and Corvina. Even though it might have these slightly larger berries, it looks almost identical to some of the Corvina biotypes. This confusion is not new. It's not just me that has trouble distinguishing between them. And its history, therefore, is understandably very entangled with that of Corvina. In fact, the varieties resemble each other so closely that many producers initially refused to believe the results of a study that came out in 2003 that showed that not only were the varieties not the same, they were, in fact, not even closely related. So to this day, no genetic links have been established to any other Veronese variety. Even though it resembles Corvina so closely, it's really hard to believe they're not the same thing, and it's even harder to believe that apparently they're not even related. In the vineyard, the variety's biggest handicap is probably its propensity to what they would call asynchronous ripening, meaning that the bunches can simultaneously have these really full, ripe berries, and on the same bunch, these green, hard, unripe, acidic little berries that are unpalatable. That makes it super challenging, and producers that really are intent on producing top quality examples of the variety must really devote a lot of time and, of course, money to meticulously sorting out those unripe berries and bunches. Despite the fact that it requires this really hands-on approach in the vineyard and the winery, it is gaining in popularity. Recently, several new clones have been developed that are trying to kind of mitigate some of this propensity towards this fully ripe berries and green berries on the same bunch. It's probably really valued in the blends of Valpolicella as it can provide a little more of this tannic backbone and structure, something that Corvina doesn't have quite as much of. So if you are looking to make an example of a wine that maybe has a little more structure, body, and ageability, having a little bit of Corvinone in there can really help provide that kind of frame for the wine to develop on. In fact, its growing importance is reflected actually in the fairly recent changes to the disciplinares of Valpolicella, Amarone, and Recioto. So previously, the variety could only comprise a maximum of 50% of the blend, but now you're allowed to have from 45 to 95% of the blend comprised of Corvinone. The variety itself is like Corvina in the fact that it has these quite thick skins, which again make it well suited to appassimento. It doesn't tend to be quite as disease prone in terms of its susceptibility to things like oidium as Corvina, so a little more resistance there. In the glass, it has a little more color than Corvina, so deep ruby in the glass. Really quite intense cherry, I think, is one of the things that really comes across for me. This kind of cherry and spice note really are kind of the dominant things. And then it can also contribute this little bit of a green herbal note that really kind of relates back to how much sorting producers have done, or like kind of the condition of the bunches when they were harvested. So if you have bunches and berries that have a lot more of those green unripe berries, then the wines in the end have much more of this herbal green sappy note to them. If you have too much of that, yeah, it's not something that can be desirable. But I really like having just a little kind of touch of that in the wines. To me, it adds a little sort of aromatic interest and lift to the wine, some freshness as well. Something that can really help in sort of a blind tasting sort of situation to determine, oh, maybe this is Valpolicella or something like that, because you get this kind of really almost like pyrazine note there that's not like a Cabernet Sauvignon pyrazine. It's something a little different. And to me, that always leads me back to Corvinone. Despite its growing popularity, monovarietal examples remain rare, and perhaps that's due in part to the fact that it's often co-planted with Corvina. However, I'm sure someone out there is making a varietal Corvinone. So please, if you know of one, or if you find one, let me know, because I would love to taste it. In terms of producers, as I mentioned, unaware to me if there are a varietal Corvinone out there. So when we talk about producers, I think for the most part, we're talking about producers from the Valpolicella area. You can think about some of the really iconic producers who, of course, are making some great examples of wines that contain Corvina and Corvinone. So really iconic producers such as Quintarelli, Delfono, Ramano, Zimme, Tedeschi, those kind of producers, Allegrini. If you can find those examples, try them for sure. Some of my kind of personal, more under the radar producers, I love the wines of Ragose, Massimago, and Secondo Marco. Those are a couple of my favorites. Almost every market out there can find some example of a wine from Valpolicella. So start your exploration anywhere, I think. In terms of food pairing, again, it's really hard to say, Corvina or Corvinone go with this particular set of foods, because as they are blended with other grape varieties and at different percentages, it's really hard to say that is a direct connection with the grape variety. But in terms of those styles of wine, I love more basic Valpolicella with antipasti, bruschetta, just really lighter kind of fare. I think it goes even well with some sort of salads that have like a red wine vinaigrette or things like that. Compare really nicely with when you start getting into things like ripasso, then you can have a little heavier food. So a nice barbecued hamburger works really well. All the wines tend to have a quite refreshing level of acidity. So for me, I like to kind of play off that and just, yes, you can kind of increase the weight of the food as the weight of the wine increases, but they always have that nice acid component to help cut through the richness of the food, refresh your palate, get you ready for the next bite. When you get into some of those heavier ripassos and of course Amarone, then you can look into things like, grilled meat, I love it with lamb, like grilled lamb, venison, some of that sort of more gamey side of meats can go well. I think it actually goes well with nicely grilled vegetables that maybe have some like concentrated balsamic vinegar on them. And then, of course, getting into the delicious recioto side of things, then chocolate for me is one of the ultimate pairings with recioto. Yeah, if you think of wines that Corvina and Corvinone are blended into, I think the world is your oyster in terms of food and wine pairings, because there are so many styles, weights, flavors that are associated with those different styles of wines that you can almost find a Valpolicella wine that will pair with anything. I hope you've enjoyed learning about Corvina and Corvinone. If you have questions or comments, I'd love to hear them. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Listen to the Italian Wine Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We're on SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Himalaya FM, and more. Don't forget to subscribe and rate the show. If you enjoy listening, please consider donating through ItalianWinePodcast.com. Any amount helps cover equipment, production, and publication costs. Until next time, cin cin.